Welcome to Metro Art and Book Talk. I'm Marianne Verdi-Haas, and we have our renowned portrait artist here, Richard Miller. Richard, you've got some fascinating material that you've done through the years, portraits of really great beauty and of important people. When did you get started in the portrait artist work?
Well, thank you, Marianne. I started probably when I was 9 or 10 years old. During the Second World War. I was doing drawings of Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt and selling them for a couple of bucks a piece, so I thought that was kind of neat. And then I did a couple of my cousins, one who died at Dieppe, and it was very rewarding. It was very important to the people that I give them this. And,
now you started with
just drawing.
Sketching, drawing.
Yeah, just drawing, sir.
And eventually you evolved into doing painting.
I started with paint pretty quickly.
Pretty quickly. My
mother was encouraging me, and it was just something I enjoyed doing. And the way the people received the portraits, that really hooked me. So it became a lifelong journey.
Well, that's a natural talent, to be able to start so young and to zone in on that talent and really expand on it.
I think you have to be a particular type of person to do that. And I just love it.
And then you taught yourself a lot on the way.
Well, I worked as an illustrator for many years. I started at 15 with a studio in Windsor, and then I went on to Toronto, and I came over to Detroit. From there I went to New York City, had an apartment on 55th and 5th Avenue for a while. I won a few awards, but I've always done portraits. Along with the commercial illustration, I just really enjoyed doing portraits.
And so you were in the advertising field then in New York? And
yeah. I used to do the Cadillac and Oldsmobile accounts here in Detroit. Those big, long, exaggerated automobiles in the center of life look Post magazines.
So at some point you abandoned that work and went into portrait work full time.
Well, actually the commercial business kind of abandoned me. In the 60s, they started this truth in advertising campaign. And what I was doing wasn't very truthful. We exaggerated them to death. But the business just turned to photography. And instead of doing retouching or something, I just left the business entirely. Went to Toronto, did a lot of portraiture up there, did a lot of thoroughbreds up there. And as a result of the thoroughbreds, I got to do the Queen, Prince Philip, and the Queen Mother. It worked out very well. And that's all I've been doing.
You, when you began doing portrait work, you said the Queen Mother and Prince Philip. How early on in your career as a portrait artist did you do that?
This would be after the 60s. And between the 60s, I think I did the Queen Mother and Prince Philip around 1970. And I did a series of Queen's Plate winners out of Toronto. And in '85, I came back to Detroit, and from there to New York. And well, no, I was in New York before the '60s, but I came back to Detroit a second time, and did a little bit of commercial work, not very much. Did some work for Mercedes, but no portraiture, and then I got involved in sculpture, and that I've been doing quite a few monumentals. And that's also a lot of fun. Very labor intensive. It keeps me young. And I can still hit a golf ball pretty good.
So the portrait work is all commission work. And what is the procedure you use? Do you you go and meet the individual and take photographs, and then how do you proceed from there?
Well, I take a lot of photography. And from there, I'll call the shots down to maybe a dozen, find a good attitude, a general composition, and then I use the photography to, I call that down to the best expression, the best descriptive gesture for the kinetics of personality, and I make a drawing. And I deliver the drawing to the subject. And I may make 2 or 3, which they approve, then I go to paint. And finally, I like to get a live sitting in so that I can get the subtlety of eye color and skin color and texture, hair color, etc. Because photography doesn't give you all of that.
Right, right. So do you suggest things to the person, like the kind of background or color, clothing to wear, or things like that?
I like them to be in an environment that they are comfortable in. And yeah, I'll suggest things. It's a back and forth thing. I'll tell them to put out a couple of outfits and let me take a look at them. And they, of course, want the same result that I do, a very good portrait. And, of course, everything is absolutely guaranteed for satisfaction.
Sure.
Because, like I say, there's nothing worse than a bad portrait, because what do you do with a bad portrait?
Sure. Now, you said earlier when we were talking that you're romantic as far as how you paint the portraits, and you would tend to make the appearance a bit more idealistic or romantic, as opposed to showing flaws and so forth.
Well, I think a little of that comes out of my my work as an illustrator. You're always enhancing the subject, and it's kind of innate in my own personality because I am a romantic and a realist. So I just like to see the best attitude on a person, and usually what I like to see is what the subject likes to see. So I've done no more than a couple of redos in my whole life, and I've never had a rejection. So I've been very fortunate.
Now, one thing about the facial features that it seems like it would be hard to get the right spacing, for example, between the eyes and the mouth. And do you take measurements, or how do you go about, or is just your eye
No,
is so?
It's optical.
Your eye is
yeah,
just so.
I don't have any trouble with getting a good likeness. I draw very well. I've been doing it for a long time.
Do you start with a particular feature first?
No, it's generally I work with the composition and make sure that it works in the area that's there, and I try to get a little attitude going. I like to see the subject move, and I can catch him photographically in a gesture that's ideal for him or her. And I do a lot of kids, a lot of children. Of course, you're not going to make them sit still for very long. But then finally, we do the live sitting at my studio, and usually the family's there, and they heckle, and this has got to be a little different, or the mouth isn't quite right.
And how long is the live sitting?
Oh, an hour, maybe two. It's mostly social. If the kid can be sitting on a stool or running around, I'll say, hey, get back here. Let me see what color your eyes are, or something. It's very casual, and it's easier for the client that way.
Then you have the lighting set up the way you want it.
Yeah.
And all that.
I try to set up with natural light as much as possible. I may use a key and let the room ambient light fill for me, or I'll bounce strobes or something. You know, depends on the situation and where I am.
Is the background the last thing you do then in the portrait?
Not necessarily. I think that's a part of the description of the individual. Like, for example, here, Dr. George Washington Carver was a botanist, so that's the reason for the flowers and the outdoor situation.
Yeah, this is a wonderful painting. Could you talk a little bit more about it?
Well, this was commissioned by Ford. They endow the university at Tuskegee. This was done for the library, and that's the original one is in the library at Tuskegee University. I redid this to make a video of the making of this portrait because it's posthumous. So I'm dealing with little black and white shreds of. There's very little photography. This was, and it was all faded. I had to put the two men in a conversational situation. Fortunately, I did have one in generally this attitude, but it was very bleached out. But I didn't want to sublimate one man over the other, so as a black man, I emerged Dr. Carver from an element of light, and as a white man, Henry Ford came out of emerged from darkness.
Now we're going to be showing an excerpt from the video that that expresses how you went through this, and
Yeah.
we're looking forward to seeing that a little later
Well,
on.
I did this video in lieu of teaching, which I don't
Sure.
have time to do,
Sure.
and really not much inclination either.
Sure.
And it's an hour and 35 minutes, and it does a very good job. We market it around the world.
Now, as far as when you get a commission to do a portrait, and from that point where it's agreed upon that you're going to do it, until the presentation to the person you've done it for, what is the time span involved?
Well, again, as an illustrator, I work to deadlines all my life, so I paint very directly and very, I guess, quickly. I don't waste any time. Everything is painted directly. I preconceive what I'm doing, and usually the color mix is pretty accurate, and I keep adjusting and refining. But mainly, if it's painted almost in a well, it's hard to say. It's just it's a little bit impressionistic.
Sure.
I like to do the detail where I want to lead the viewer.
Sure.
Of the portrait.
And that's several months that it takes.
No. This one here I did in about less than 2 weeks.
Amazing.
My self-portrait I did in 2 days. So. It just depends on how I feel. I'm kind of lazy sometimes. But.
So are there particular colors that you use more consistently than others? You have a palette.
My palette is pretty basic and fairly limited. I use about a dozen basic colors. And I may add or subtract depending on what I'm doing. But and I make sure they're all pure pigment and very pure color. And good color, and I don't use any medium with my oil because I prefer it just demeans the pigment.
Sure.
It just degrades the pigment. So I use just terpenoid and the paint, and the terpenoid evaporates, and you're left with pure pigment, which is very permanent. I usually use linen canvas too, which stands up very well.
And so you had mentioned earlier that you show a sketch. Preliminary drawing to the individual who is commissioned the work.
Not all the time.
Right.
Quite
At some point in the middle of the painting, do you have it shown to the individual who's
No, before I start, they'll see a sketch.
Oh, but that's it. They don't see it halfway through, or
no, because it may not look very good halfway through. The sketch is just basically for composition, and I'll shade it a little bit, make sure where I'm going with the darks and lights, and that's all a very big part of the composition as well. Value and color and basic drawing. It all goes into the composition of any portrait, and it's very important. This one here was particularly troublesome because of the elements that I wanted in there. They were sitting at a table that was cluttered. There's a tie-in, and they were good friends. This is a little unusual, strange, because Henry Ford was always thought of as a bigot, but he's a character.
So the framing is lovely framing. Do you furnish the frames also?
Usually we do. We buy wholesale frames, and mostly I work to standard sizes.
Sure.
Which saves the client quite a bit of money.
So speaking of money in general, what is your price range on a
well, it varies. You can get a portrait from me for a couple $1,000s. You can also spend $20,000, $30,000 for that. Depending on what I'm doing.
Sure.
There is a portrait fee schedule on my site, which explains it. It depends on how large it is, how much time I'm going to have to devote to it, and etc.
What is the largest portrait you've ever done?
I did one that was 5 feet by 10 feet for a very dear friend of mine whose wife died of cancer, and he endowed the Plymouth Library, and they renamed the children's wing, which is enormous. And the back wall was, they wanted this large portrait of Charlotte with her 3 grandchildren. Of course, she was deceased. And that painting is 5 feet by 10 feet canvas. That's probably they're pretty close to life size.
I would imagine that would be a bit harder to work with. Is it, or?
No.